Determine the left-sided limit and the right-sided limit and the two-sided limit as x approaches pi over 2 of negative 2 secant x tangent x. Each of these involves the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of negative 2 secant x tangent x. The first thing to do is try plugging a pi over 2 in for each of the x's. That will give negative 2 secant of pi over 2 tangent of pi over 2, which is equal to negative 2 times the secant of pi over 2 is 1 over the cosine of pi over 2, which is a 0, times the tangent of pi over 2, which is the sine of pi over 2, 1, divided by cosine of pi over 2, 0. We can multiply all of the numerators. Negative 2 times 1 is a negative 2, over multiply all the denominators. 0 times 0 is 0. The 0 in the denominator is not actually a 0, since x is only approaching a pi over 2 here. It's not actually reaching pi over 2. But a limit result of a non-zero number divided by 0 is equal to positive infinity or negative infinity, where the sign of the infinity often depends on the side the limit is approaching from. We therefore have to work out each of the one-sided limits separately. We have the left-sided limit indicated by the negative superscript on the pi over 2. And the right-sided limit indicated by the positive superscript on the pi over 2. Let's start with the left-sided limit. The first thing to do is to rewrite the trig function so we can see what is making 0 in the denominator. The secant can be replaced with 1 over cosine, and the tangent can be replaced by sine over cosine. We can now multiply all of the numerators together. Negative 2 times 1 times sine of x will give a negative 2 sine x, divided by, multiply all the denominators. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0, so that's what's making 0 in the denominator here as x approaches pi over 2. We're going to analyze it a little closer according to the side it's approaching from for that cosine. X is approaching to pi over 2 from the left side here. Left side of pi over 2 is less than pi over 2. Less than pi over 2, but close to it. We'll put it in the first quadrant on the unit circle. The cosine in the first quadrant is a positive. However, it's approaching to pi over 2, cosine approaches to 0, so therefore the cosine can be replaced with a positive 0. The pi over 2 can plug in for all other x's. So the result of this will be a negative 2 sine of pi over 2 divided by, and the cosine can be replaced with a positive 0. It's cosine squared, so it'll be positive 0 squared. In the numerator, we have negative 2 times the sine of pi over 2, which is a 1, divided by a positive squared is positive, 0 squared is 0. Negative 2 times 1 is a negative 2 over a positive 0. A negative divided by a positive is a negative. Non-zero over 0 is an infinity. And there is the result of the left-sided limit. The right-sided limit will work out in a similar fashion. Start by renaming secant as 1 over cosine and tangent as sine over cosine, so that we can see the denominators that are making 0. Multiply all the numerators, multiply all the denominators. The result will be the same as the left-sided limit. But it will analyze a little bit different here. We are on the right side of pi over 2, which is greater than pi over 2. That puts it in the second quadrant on the unit circle, and the cosine in the second quadrant is a negative number. However, it is approaching to pi over 2, cosine approaches to 0, but it will stay negative, so we can replace cosine with a negative 0. Pi over 2 can then be plugged in for all other x's. That will give negative 2 sine of pi over 2 divided by, and replace cosine with a negative 0. It's cosine squared, so it'll be quantity squared. This gives a negative 2 times the sine of pi over 2, which is a 1, over a negative squared is a positive, 0 squared is a 0. In the numerator, negative 2 times 1 is negative 2, over the positive 0. A negative over a positive is negative. Non-zero over 0 is an infinity. And there is the result of the right-sided limit. The two-sided limit depends on the results of the two one-sided limits. Since they do match each other here, the two-sided limit up here will be the same value, negative infinity. And there is the results of the three different limits.